my memory, and I can tell you that Jonathan Mingle is a freelance journalist whose work has appeared in numerous publications, including the New York Times, where he published an op-ed piece in May. He is a graduate of Dartmouth College and the University of California at Berkeley, from which he has a master's degree in energy and resources science. He has published a book called Fire and Ice, which is about the people in the Zanskar Valley,
Northern India.
Northern India,
Yeah.
and their struggles with the changing climate. And most recently, his book Gaslight, which I am holding a sample of here, was published by Island Press, the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, and the Fight for America's Energy Future. Jonathan is going to talk to us about this subject and others that he might be interested. I'm hoping he'll talk about backcountry skiing because I'm really looking forward to it. So, without further ado, thank you for being here. Thank you for your patience with me, and welcome to Jonathan.
Thank you. Thanks for turning out. It's so nice out. I was like, oh no one's going to come. But thank you for coming. Thank you, Becky, for lining this up, and to the library for hosting it. Yeah, so I'm an independent journalist. I live in Lincoln, about a half hour from here. This is my local bookstore, nearest major library. I write mostly about climate and energy, sometimes other things. And yeah, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about my book that came out in May and how I kind of found this story and why I thought it was worthy of book-length treatment, how I stumbled onto it, and what I think some of the key lessons, I'm not going to give you a play-by-play. You can read the book, for all the twists and turns, but I'll try to distill some of the key takeaways that I took from the process of reporting and writing it over the last 4 or 5 years. So that's my plan. But just to set the stage a little bit, and this is, the region that the book covers. The mountains of West Virginia through Central Virginia. It's the story of what was probably, when it was proposed, the largest natural gas project ever to come out of Appalachia. And the company behind it was the most powerful company in Virginia. It's called Dominion Energy. If you live in Virginia, everyone knows Dominion, but outside of Virginia, I need to explain just how connected and influential this company is. But I'll get into that a little bit. So I'm just going to tell you a little story about the story, how I kind of got into this whole project, and hopefully that'll be illuminating. But to do that, I need to back up a little bit. And so, as Becky said, about 10 years ago, I published a book. This was my first book, called Fire and Ice. And Fire and Ice is a book about soot, in part. It's what scientists call black carbon. And at the time, I thought, this is an overlooked part of the climate change story. And I decided to set out and tell the tale of all the damage being done around the world, but also in this one village in far northern India in the Himalayas by this form of pollution. And so the book wound up being equal parts the story of the havoc wreaked by black carbon, soot, to people's lungs, to people's livelihoods, but also the story of this community I spent a lot of time in that was in the process of relocating, 1,000-year-old village, running out of water, chronic drought, getting worse and worse as their glaciers and snowfields retreated and shrunk above them. And so the book really was, equal parts the story of these characters. Soot is a character, and the folks in this village. And the feedback I got from that was helpful. It tended to fall into one of two camps. I heard from people who said, I loved all the stuff, the science about soot and what it does to glaciers and deep in your lungs, it's fascinating, but I could have done with less about the villagers, right? And then I heard from people who said, God, I love being in the village and learning about their life and their culture, but there's way too much detail about, combustion. And so, I took that to heart. There are a lot of lessons learned from the first book. And perhaps it should have been obvious to me, but certainly in retrospect, it now is. Most people, especially when you pick up a nonfiction narrative book, and especially if it's like climate, environmental subject, people want stories about people, and people they can relate to in some way. It's not only helpful, I'd argue it's necessary. It helps you grab a handle on a problem that can be just overwhelming in scope and consequence and huge. So that's what people want. And so I found myself a few years later after writing this, I was back to my freelance hustle, and I was writing a lot about methane. Another, what I thought was an overlooked pollutant in the climate story. There's carbon dioxide, there's nitrous oxide, there's hydrofluorocarbons, there's methane. And methane, it turns out, is responsible for about a third of all of global warming today. Not many people know that. Not many people think about methane at all. But I started talking to scientists about this scary curve. People who were trying to figure out why methane levels were spiking so dramatically. And they used words like alarming to describe this. And so I wrote some stories about that. And around that time, so 6 years ago, I guess, I was also looking, as a freelancer, you're looking for things that aren't maybe being talked about enough. You're trying to add value to the conversation and not do something that the Washington Post is already covering, right? Their staff, right? And I was keeping tabs on this, let's just call it a boom, a natural gas infrastructure building boom that the U.S. has been going through the last decade plus. And I knew that there's a little confusion out there about natural gas. For instance, this was true a decade ago, and this is true today. Most Americans don't know that natural gas is methane. It is methane. It's 90% methane. That means that natural gas, which is often touted by the gas and utility industries as a affordable, reliable, clean energy solution, is itself a very potent greenhouse gas. Most Americans do not associate natural gas with fossil fuels. A majority of Americans have positive associations with the words natural gas. So I knew all this, and I was writing about it, and looking for a story that could kind of bring this down to earth and human scale. And I'm from Virginia. I live in Vermont. I have for a long time, but I grew up in Virginia, in Charlottesville, Virginia. And my parents live there, my sister lives there. So I take my family there to visit frequently anyway. And I was on a trip, a visit there, and I'd been keeping tabs on this fight I'd heard about against this pipeline. I knew about Dominion Energy, of course, because I'm from Virginia. Everyone knows about Dominion Energy. They're the monopoly utility if you want to turn your lights on. 2/3 of Virginians have to get their power from Dominion Energy. They are notoriously connected in the state capital of Richmond, but in other state capitals too. And so I knew Dominion was kind of, at the time, a poster child, really, for America's natural gas, headlong embrace of natural gas. They owned fracking wells in West Virginia and Utah. They owned gas storage facilities. They owned gas utilities, which are the companies that pipe the gas to your kitchen stove or your furnace. And they owned many electric utilities in different parts of the country. They were a huge company. And they were doubling down on gas. And this pipeline that my book's about was their biggest bet yet. So I kind of knew all about that. And I caught wind that while I was in Charlottesville, there was a court case happening. And it was just down the road in the federal courthouse in downtown Charlottesville. And I thought, I'm just going to go. And, this will be a low-cost, reporting outing. I'm here anyway. And I go in, and the case was like I mean, it was designed to make your eyes glaze over. It was like two super obscure federal laws, and the question was like, which preempted the other? The Natural Gas Act or the National Flood Insurance Program? You know, it's all about a county in Virginia, Nelson County, in the Blue Ridge Mountains, very rural, sparsely populated, had decided that Dominion Energy could not bring its 42-inch pipe full of highly pressurized, highly flammable methane under its rivers and streams, that it would have to get permission for each stream crossing. And so it was a floodplain ordinance that no one paid attention to at the time. And they said no to Dominion. So this little county became the first, all on the 600-mile route of this pipeline, that Dominion Energy sued, brought all of its massive financial wherewithal to bear on little old Nelson County. So I went to this courtroom and I sat through this case, and like, there's one of the streams they wanted to cross, and I just put up like, you know, the memorandum to reinforce the point, like, this stuff is designed to repel attention for normal people. It's boring. And, but as soon as I got there, I noticed that one side of the courtroom were Dominion's lawyers from the White Shoe Law Firm in Richmond, and then empty. And on the other side of the room, it was packed. It was packed with people of all ages, and I sat down and I quickly deduced a lot of these folks are from Nelson County. And I was like, Nelson County is 15,000 people. Like, what percent of Nelson County is in this courtroom right now? And they were following the proceedings like with the attention and passion of like, it was like the final match of the US Open or something. That, you know, people were groaning out loud at arguments being made. Again, like really technical, esoteric stuff. There was a woman scribbling furiously next to me, reminding me of my grandma. And like, the energy in the room was so obvious. And I left that thinking like, oh, there's something going on here. There's a story here. And that week, I met some of the folks in that room, and that's Dominion, faceless, you know, energy company. There are 2 office towers in downtown Richmond. And that is one of the people I met that week, Joyce Burton. She's a physical therapist. And the people I met early on, and this is 2019, wound up being a lot of the main characters in my book. And I got a sense pretty quickly of why people had turned out to that courtroom and why, by that point, they'd been fighting this thing for 5 years. Why they were so dug in and determined to keep fighting. Even though, like Joyce Burton, some of them had left careers, upended their lives, like given up their whole retirement plan to devote all their waking hours to fighting the Atlantic Coast Pipeline. I was like, well, why? What explains that? What motivates people to do that? I was kind of hooked, like, and so I kept reporting. I climbed the mountain with Joyce. She took me to see her favorite chestnut oak tree on Roberts Mountain, which would have been flattened, blasted, removed the top of the mountain, because you have to create a wide enough, four-lane highway wide corridor for them to bury their pipe, right, deep enough, and they have to reshape mountains. Later that week, I went to a rally, which had the feeling of kind of like a rebel outpost insurgency strategy meeting. And one of the generals is this gentleman, Tom Hadwin. I met him, a retired energy utility executive, who had other plans for his retirement, but found himself working 6 days a week, unpaid, going all over Virginia, trying to convince chambers of commerce, state regulators, ordinary people at farmers markets, why there was really no need for Dominion to build this project. It was, in his words, a cash machine, an ATM machine for Dominion, a very lucrative investment that didn't really serve the public interest. So I met him. And then I met this guy. His name is Will Fenton. He's a very shy master woodcarver whose life stream was to build a Bavarian-style village on top of the Blue Ridge Mountains. And he did it tree by tree. He felled the trees, stripped the bark, you know, and he built it by hand. And as I talked to these people, I got a sense of what they've been going through. I just showed up, 5 years later after they'd been fighting this thing. And everyone had their reasons, and they were different reasons. And that was fascinating too, but they had found common cause, even though different concerns brought them to oppose this project. This gentleman I met, Rick Webb, he had just retired after 35 years working as a research scientist at the University of Virginia. He's an expert on brook trout, and he had documented painstakingly brook trout habitat. And he had shown how in this part of the Central Appalachian region, brook trout had bounced back from acid rain caused by coal power plant pollution. The law was working, the Clean Air Act, and he retires and just tries to ride off into the sunset. He's a beekeeper. He's like, maybe I'll just make some honey now. And then 2 months later, he learns about the Atlantic Coast Pipeline coming through his county in far western Virginia. And he says, I know what I'm going to be doing for the next year or two with my retirement. He was off by like a decade. And he dove right into fighting it. And I met the family of this gentleman, John Ed Purvis, whose family had been on their land for 10 generations, since 1768. And now Dominion Energy comes along and says, we need to build our gas pipeline to keep the lights on and to fuel businesses in Norfolk, Hampton Roads, Eastern North Carolina. And sorry, we need to take your land to do that. And John Ed Purvis, who, conservative-leaning family, back when the Keystone Pipeline and the Dakota Access Pipeline stuff was happening, they look at those protesters and say, why are they making such a fuss? We need the jobs, we need the energy. And they go through this painful journey, realizing how little power they have, even though their tenure on this land predates the United States Constitution, right? But under eminent domain, Dominion can now take part of it. And so his family comes to this fight. They don't care about climate change, but the property rights issue, the abuse of eminent domain, which is supposed to be for projects that serve the public interest, rubs them the wrong way. And then I meet Wisteria Johnson, whose family has been on her land in Nelson County, Virginia, for 7 or 8 generations, but probably more. They don't have a record before the 1870s because she's descended from enslaved black Virginians. And back in the Civil War, and before, they couldn't have title to land. And she's also descended from Native Americans. And she took me up to show me this boulder where her great-great-grandmother had ground corn. And you can kind of see there's a depression in the boulder. And you can see the channel where the corn juice came out. And the pipeline would have gone right by there. And so her family came to the fight out of concern about safety. They would have been living in what's called the blast radius, if there's a rupture or explosion. And so I got to meeting all these people and getting a sense of what motivated, what drove them to really, it's not an exaggeration to say, you're not going to your kids' soccer games anymore, right? You're not doing all the things you thought you would be doing, whether it's with your retirement or with your family, your job. And it's pretty simple for her. They live in a remote, in a lot of ways it reminds me of parts of Lincoln where I live. The electricity didn't come until she was a little girl, and then the phone line. And people are like, look, if this brought some public benefit, we're willing to sacrifice in some way and give up some land. But they just couldn't see how this pipeline was going to benefit not only them, but communities along the way. You couldn't tap into it, even if you wanted the methane gas in it. It was just cutting through. So I just describe all that because that is kind of what brought me into the story and made me think, it took me 5 years to write my first book, oh, geez, I don't want to do this again. But I was like, okay, maybe I do want to do this again. And, like I said, people came to it with a wide range of motivations. And this map gives you a sense of some of them. it was cutting through public lands. It was cutting through national forest in West Virginia, through the Shenandoah Valley. They would have bored a mile-long tunnel through the Blue Ridge Mountains, under the Blue Ridge Parkway, the Appalachian Trail, under the James River. And along the way, have to get thousands of easements from individual private landowners to make its way down to North Carolina. And people were worried about the quality of their well water. And like I said, safety if you live near this thing. It goes through some of the steepest terrain in the East Coast and some of the most landslide-prone terrain in North America. And it's just a map. There was a terrible hurricane in 1969 that killed 1% of Nelson County's population, dumped 32 inches of rain in 8 hours. That was extreme, but they're used to getting extreme rainfall. And so people were really worried, like, if you have this giant pipe full of highly pressurized gas, and we get one of the severe storms that we know we get from time to time, oh, and by the way, seem to be happening more frequently, that's a concern. And the other map is of karst. I don't know if any of you have ever driven down 81 through Virginia, the Shenandoah Valley. You see signs for Luray Caverns. The whole region is underlaid with porous limestone. There are underground rivers. A lot of municipal water supplies are connected to them in some of the cities in this part of Virginia, in West Virginia. And so people they know this, right? They live there. It's where the water supply for Washington, D.C. rises in Augusta County, Virginia, flows into the Potomac, right, the Shenandoah. And so people were really worried about this. If you stick your straw down, it's like Swiss cheese. You know, you leak whatever you leak as you're building this pipeline, or if there's a rupture, are we suddenly contaminating water supply across the region? Dominion's answer is always, we have the best technology, the best engineers, trust us, and we'll figure it out. And so, you know, once I decided that I should write a book, I was immediately confronted with some challenges. And one was, you want to be fair to everyone involved and really put the best case forward for this pipeline, which, you know, the energy company, their argument was we needed to keep the lights on, right? To supercharge the economy, economic growth depends on getting more gas out of the Marcellus Shale, which stretches from New York through Pennsylvania, down Virginia, West Virginia, where, you know, it's one of the biggest gas deposits in the world, and we got to get that gas out. It's cheap, abundant, made in America. It'll create jobs, but we needed to keep the lights on. And that's the governor of Virginia 10 years ago, Terry McAuliffe, with the CEO of Dominion Energy, saying this is going to be great. So, you know, when I decided to write the book, I was like, how do I communicate to a normal human being who isn't like reading the fine print of the Natural Gas Act or like clicking refresh on the website of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission every day, the stakes of this fight and this project. And I decided to open the book in 2020, near the end of the story, at the Supreme Court. One of the cases challenging this pipeline, these people fighting tooth and nail, farmers, innkeepers, nurses, physical therapists, retired scientists, took it all the way to the Supreme Court. And so I did that. I figured, like, I need to signal that this is important. And Supreme Court, in a lot of people's minds, they go, oh, if it got to the Supreme Court, they don't take a lot of cases. It must be important. But then I immediately jumped back to 2014, because I think that people want to, it's easiest, these kinds of narratives, both for me to tell it, but for people reading it, to follow chronologically. This happened, then this happened, then this happened. I still face some challenges, though. I had one thing going for me, which is that it didn't take long for local people who lived on the route of the pipeline to smell a rat, right? To like, I'm getting a whiff of snake oil here. You're telling me it's in our interest. I know the terrain. I know the potential fallout from not even just accidents, but even if it works properly, from how it'll disrupt local livelihoods. I don't think it's in the public interest. I'm going to fight you. Like, it didn't take long for people to organize against this project and give Dominion Energy a very hostile reception when they went on their charm offensive in these county offices and courtrooms. And so I could quickly say, like, look, the battle lines were drawn early on. And then the question becomes, how do these people fight this enormously powerful $70 billion energy company? I had another thing going for me, which is that, spoiler alert, you know, it's on the dust jacket, so I'm not really spoiling it. They won. The grassroots opponents of this project won. And that also helped me decide to write the book, because that doesn't happen. It is the first time, to my knowledge, that a fossil gas project of this scale was successfully stopped by grassroots opposition. There are good examples of smaller pipelines, even in New England, but like something this massive that these energy companies, Dominion and Duke, another huge energy company, had thrown so many resources into. July 2020, they quietly announced they're abandoning the project. Right. They abandoned, so they canceled the project in 2020.
Because
I'll get to that. Yeah. So, you know, that was working in my favor. You have kind of a David and Goliath story, really, right? But it's not a David. It's Davids. It's thousands of Davids, right? And so, you know, I do all my reporting. I come home to Vermont with my mountain of notes and my transcribed interviews. And the two things that really kept me up late at night in my little cabin in Lincoln, one was the action of a story like this, to get to this point where she's Joyce Burton, who, you know, left her career to fight this project and unite her neighbors against it, or is holding that newspaper, Victory, is a lot of what? What is the action of a story like this? It's a lot of meetings. It's a lot of going to Board of Zoning Appeals hearings. It's going, sometimes you're marching. Yeah, exactly. I mean, there are no car crashes. There's not a lot of like high stakes drama. I mean, there is, I would argue, but it's happening in these compressed environments of like, you know, rooms like this. They gathered in the public library in Stanton, Virginia in the fall of 2014 and have a meeting. It was probably a group this size in a room like this, in a library just like this, actually. And they decide, ordinary folks from that part of Virginia, that, all right, how are we going to organize, and who's going to write the emails, and like, who's going to contact the journalists and the lawyers. And within months, they've created a coalition, formally, with 30, and then 40, and then 50 plus other organizations under its umbrella. It's this like spontaneous self-organization happens. But the action is taking place in like, they're going to the headquarters of FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, and like, how do you bring drama out of that? That was a challenge. Okay? Courtroom arguments have a certain amount of built-in conflict and tension, and that's good. But a lot of these things are like protests, and but it was the stuff of like small d democracy is what you're portraying, right? And so the book becomes the story of these ordinary people who determine that this thing is not in the public interest. They start doing the regulators' jobs for them. They take it upon themselves to push on every door and see which opens, right? They push on the door early on of their state legislators. Guess what? All the state legislators get money from Dominion Energy. They go to FERC headquarters, the Senate-appointed commissioners of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. A very obscure, no reason you should know what that is, very powerful agency that regulates interstate gas and oil pipelines, hydroelectric facilities, electricity markets. Again, this stuff is like, trust me, I've spent a lot of time trying to persuade editors to let me write an article where the headline is, FERC is the most important climate actor you've never heard of. They're always rejected. And I understand why. It's insanely boring stuff. But they push on that door, they're like, FERC's going to be useless. They're not going to help us at all. No one's coming to save them, right? We'll do it ourselves. And so the book, it becomes the story of how these folks forced scrutiny. There's Rick Webb with his binoculars, and they felled trees on the West Virginia border, and he's out there, and he builds an army. I mean, just to give you one example of the extraordinary lengths to which these ordinary people have to go, because the companies go to very extreme lengths to get their way, even though the field is so tilted in their favor. They're still willing to spend an enormous amount to get this built, because it is going to be very lucrative if they do. Rick Webb, the retired brook trout scientist, he's a researcher. That's what he does for a living. And he's like, I'm going to figure out how these things get built. And he realizes no one's ever built something like this on the steep slopes of Appalachia. They do it in Oklahoma or Texas where it's flat. And those crews come, and he quickly figures out it's like a kind of open heart surgery across steep, rain-soaked terrain with very unstable soils. They will have to blast and remove mountaintops. They will have to cross thousands of streams. And so what does Rick Webb do? Just to give you an example of, again, how these folks take it upon themselves to do the regulators' jobs for them. He builds what he calls calls it CSI, the Citizen Surveillance Initiative, but it's supposed to be like crime scene investigation TV show. And they go up in airplanes, volunteer pilots, drone operators, people hiking once they start building this pipeline to the root of the pipeline and documenting those cases where Dominion's crews are not doing what they said they would do, and reporting violations where sediment flows into streams and rivers. They fly over the route, take thousands of photos, and they put it all online. It's publicly accessible. They build a website, which no one has ever done this before. Very sophisticated website with GIS maps, and you can go to any point on the route, and you can see pictures like this, and you can overlay it with the construction documents of the pipeline that they have to submit to federal agencies. It's all public. And eventually they heard that their maps were so good that Dominion was using the map system they built. And these are guys, again, meeting in the library, GIS wizards and local college kids and retired scientists and volunteer pilots in a two-seater Cessna flying over the route. And they take these striking images, right, of the open heart surgery underway. And they also document it, when it rains, and it's just an ordinary rainstorm, excavators up to their tracks in mud. That's not supposed to happen, right? And so that becomes kind of the story as well, is people harness their fury at being ignored and their concerns being dismissed to discover they have some, not only some hidden expertise, but they have more power than they think they do. But like I said, some of it is just going and protesting outside of FERC and getting arrested by Homeland Security, drawing attention to this, right, to this issue. Because the thing that, and I just put this up because this was a mailer that Dominion sent out to people on the route. Once they realized they had a problem, people were not excited about this. They're like, okay, we'll separate myth from fact, and we'll allay your concerns. People are worried, am I going to see the pipeline? And they're like, don't worry, there's way more underground gas pipelines than even interstate highways in Virginia. Yet few people ever done this. And when I read that, again, you're looking how do I make this interesting to normal people who don't follow this stuff for a living? This helped me too. Yeah, few people ever noticed. That became a Rosetta Stone for me. These companies were really banking on the fact that most people don't notice. Even people, and I drove through West Virginia along the route, there's gas infrastructure everywhere. Pipelines buried of various diameters all over the place. And most people, you just drive by, unless it's going through your yard. But these folks that I write about in the book forced people to notice. And not only did they force their neighbors to notice, and by the way, the people who fought it hardest, it wasn't coming through their land. It wasn't even coming through their town. They just weren't having it, right? They quickly determined that we can't just push this onto some other community. It shouldn't be built anywhere in the street. So they kind of forced people to notice the damage, the risk, the potential consequences of building something like this. And on the other side, there's Dominion saying, we'll keep the lights on, create some jobs, trust us, we know what we're doing, right? And eventually they forced Wall Street to notice too, because all this stuff that requires Bank of America and Citibank to like finance it. And Wall Street starts to sour on this project. They force federal courts to notice. So there are multiple legal challenges to all the permits you need, from the Fish and Wildlife Service to National Park Service. You know, a project like this needs a lot of permits to get built. And they challenged all of them. And they won most of those court cases. These grassroots groups with their savvy nonprofit lawyers. And so it becomes a story of how, against all odds, you know, there's the Supreme Court. They win the day. And I'll just close by saying, like, I'll just distill what I took away from spending a lot of time with these people and then coming home to Vermont and being like, gee, how did they do it? You know, that's kind of the story I want to tell in the book. It's like, how did they pull this off against overwhelming odds, and what lessons can be distilled out of that for other fights and other communities. And then also there's the story of, you know, how natural gas has been sold for many decades as a clean energy solution, which we could get into. I think I determined at the end of it all that they really had three superpowers, these people, that they hadn't been aware of until this thing landed in their lives. One was, everyone feels isolated at first. You get a letter, this thing like John Ed Purvis, what do I do? I know Dominion, they win at everything they try to do. What's the point of fighting this? These companies are banking on you not talking to your neighbor down the road. And so what they did very early on, seems simple, but it's huge. They just start talking to each other. And things kind of snowball from there. So overcoming this sense of like being alone with this thing, the weight of the world on you, and discovering, no, your neighbors might share your concerns. It seems small and banal, it's not. The other superpower is that they had an ability to imagine a future in which this didn't get built, and the company instead made other investments, cleaner, safer investments. So this sense that this is not inevitable, right? When all your friends and neighbors are saying, again, Dominion, you're not going to win. And these people I write about had many people tell them, I'm with you, I don't think this is a good idea either, but you're wasting my time. And so, you know, I became fascinated. Like, who are the people who are able to say, no, I think we can win? And overcoming that sense of fatalism, you know, pick your issue, or pick your, you know, the climate fight writ large. It's easy to succumb to that. I know, I write about it for a living. And I think that's a superpower that these folks discovered they didn't know they had. And then the last one is they realized pretty quickly this is about power, right? No one was coming to their aid, right? All the elected officials, all the people whose job description is to steward the public interest at the federal agencies, the state agencies, sleep at the switch. And they realized, like, we're up against a very powerful set of interests, and our job is to take some attention away from their narrative and some measure of power. And they did. So before they canceled the pipeline, Virginia state legislators passed a clean energy law, first in the South, that required Dominion to have 100% clean energy by 2045. I don't think that happens without this fight happening. It spurred this backlash. that kind of spilled over beyond the boundaries of this project and the route. And I'll leap ahead. They wound up building this instead. So Dominion Energy, instead of building the 600-mile-long Atlantic Coast Pipeline, they cancel it. Suddenly they're taking out full-page ads in the New York Times talking about the wind farm they're going to build.
Where is it?
That is 26 miles off the coast of Virginia Beach. And they are now building the largest offshore wind farm in the U.S. Again, I don't know if that happens. If Joyce Burton and Rick Webb and Will Fenton and Wisteria Johnson and all these other people I write about, if they don't devote their time and energy to trying to push this very powerful energy company in that direction instead. So I'm just going to leave it there, and if you have questions, I'd be happy to take them. But I just wanted to kind of like pull out, for me, going forward with my work as a climate energy journalist, but even just like as a parent of two young kids who are going to inherit a very different world than the one I grew up in. I found it helpful, despite it taking me like 5 years and many late nights of figuring out how to make this story something that someone would want to read to the end. That it's fuel for me going forward with my work. So. And if you have questions, I'm happy to.
If you have a question.
Yeah.
How did this group fund the fight? How did they pay their lawyers? I mean, those kinds of fights require a lot of legal framework.
They held fundraisers. So early on, there were all these hyper-local groups. Friends of Nelson County, Friends of Buckingham County, the Augusta County Alliance, Wild Rivers in West Virginia. There were all these groups that had either cropped up during this fight and sold t-shirts and like went to the brewery and said, hey, will you host a fundraiser, and had concerts, individual donations. But that doesn't really add up too much. Their key stroke of luck was when a group called the Southern Environmental Law Center got involved, which their budget is a pittance compared to Dominion's operating budget, but by nonprofit standards, pretty substantial. And they've been around for 40 years or so. And in the South, they're basically like a nonprofit law firm who fights to protect public lands. And that was their original way into this. They saw it going through the national forest. They thought, this doesn't belong there. It's going through endangered species habitat. There are all kinds of risks that aren't being accounted for. But what's interesting about that is once that group got on board, they built out this whole practice within their organization to fight what they view as unnecessary natural gas projects across the region. Tennessee, Florida, like all over.
How far north will they come?
They won't come north of Virginia because they are the Southern Environmental Law Center, but they work with other groups like Sierra Club and the big name and green NGOs, and they got involved in this too. But I think the key thing was when that group and then a smaller group of plucky lawyers who've been fighting coal companies in West Virginia for a long time to protect waterways and air quality, public health, they got involved too. And so those two groups, eventually, they're the ones who litigated all the permits. They went to Supreme Court and won most of those cases and got enough of those permits thrown out by skeptical federal judges who are usually defer to these agencies. But they were like, you didn't do your homework on any of this. And again, permit out. And that slowed down the project long enough that over time it gets expensive to keep all those crews and equipment idling and to keep going back to Bank of America asking for more money, that the companies had to cut bait and walk away from it. So their strategy, which they described as like death from 1,000 cuts, we're going to fight it from all these fronts. It proved successful. And I think early on people were really focused like, how are we going to get money to do this? And it proved to not be as important as they thought. And an example of that is there was a group of influential, at the northern end of Nelson County, big landowners, Republican Party donors, lobbyists, and people connected politically who had lived in DC but now have a big farm in this part of Virginia. They started fighting this too. But they were NIMBYs. They just didn't want it coming through their farm. And as soon as it moved away, they stopped fighting. But even before that, they're like, we'll spend millions on a media campaign against Dominion. And they did that, had zero effect. So like the deep-pocketed lobbyist people, they were up against a far bigger beast, But the grassroots folks, they had staying power. They had persistence more than money. Yeah.
So how do we change the perception, that natural gas is green and
Yeah.
it's been puzzling me for a while, and I just, I actually didn't know that it was that high methane content.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I just, how do we do that?
Some climate advocates and some journalists have stopped calling it natural gas. They'll call it methane gas or fossil gas or fossil methane. But it's hard.
Okay.
It's got this built-in branding advantage, and it's had it for 2 centuries, almost. And that's tough to change the narrative, right? And the industry will say, look, the only reason our emissions have gone down in the U.S. The last 12 to 15 years is because we retired a bunch of coal power plants and replaced it with gas. And that's part of the story. But to me, if you are a journalist writing about these issues and you're not zooming your frame out a bit and saying, well, what about every investment in a piece of gas infrastructure that this pipeline could operate for 80 to 100 years? It's supposed to fuel power plants that could operate 30, 40, 50 years. Gas-fired power plants. What's the opportunity cost of that investment, right? Great battery storage, solar, wind, efficiency. Energy efficiency always gets forgotten, but utilities don't like investing in energy efficiency, which would obviate the need to build any power plant. So there are alternatives. It's not just coal or nothing, right? And even I would argue a decade ago that was the case, right? But the industry's been very successful at saying, oh, no, gas is cleaner. And because we have so much of it, energy security, and they'll wrap it in all these gauzy narratives about natural gas equals patriotism. Right? And that's hard. It's to me, I wrote a piece in the Times a few months ago arguing that I do think the language we use is important, but I think even more important, much more important, is changing the incentives that produce projects like this. Where even a Dominion consultant I interviewed, when all is said and done, I said, do you think it should have been built? He's like, no, we didn't need it. He's like, it's probably good it wasn't built. And they admit under oath to their regulators, they never actually modeled. They never studied whether they needed it to supply their power, to in fact keep the lights on. Because they have to go under oath to their regulators. And if you read through that stuff, you're like, whoa. Look, why, if that's the case, why do companies like this, and it's still happening, keep proposing these projects? Because they are guaranteed 14% rate of return. And the cost of building it pass on to their captive rate. It's like if you are a CEO, you should be fired for not trying to do that. Because your job is to maximize returns for your shareholders. Your board will fire you and replace you with someone who will do that. This is a gold rush. There are so many companies racing to build these pipelines out of that part of Appalachia because they saw a lot of money to be made. And they weren't wrong. They ran into a buzzsaw. I think the people of Nelson County. Yeah.
Did Dominion use any religious arguments for the need for the pipeline or any reasoning?
You know, Dominion had a big operation to reach out to local civic institutions, Boy Scout troops, barbecues, you know, like really charm offensive and like the big checks, you know, like hold the big check of like $1,000 for fixing roads after some flood in West Virginia. They didn't really, you know, their arguments were mostly about jobs from building it, temporary jobs, tax revenue for these rural counties, and economic growth, kind of vague economic growth promises, and keeping your lights on and keeping your bills low. But the faith piece came in on the other side. And so one of the things I write about, there's a chapter of the book where I write about a community in central Virginia called Union Hill. Union Hill is a historically black community. It was settled right after the Civil War by recently emancipated enslaved Virginians. And Dominion wanted to build its compressor station right in the middle of their community. And the compressor is like 24 jet turbines operating around the clock.
Very noisy.
Very noisy and emitting air pollutants. And they decided to locate it like right in the middle of this community.
Of course.
And then they argued that the people who lived there didn't actually live there, and that it wasn't majority black. They said it was like 20 or 30%, and people don't live here during the week. And so the community organized themselves and went door to door to document that, in fact, we do live here. And in fact, we are mostly African American, 70% or so. And most of these families have been in this community since the 1860s, you know. The churches were where that action happened. It's Baptist, you throw a rock, you're going to hit a Baptist church in this part of Virginia. And what was fascinating is like there's a community of yogis, of like yoga practitioners who've been in this county since the 1970s.
So this is south of Nelson County.
South of Nelson County on the James River, other side of the James River. And these two communities who never really interacted before, in the course of this fight, they're buddies now. The yogis and the Baptists. And the pastor of the Baptist church is like inviting some of the visiting yoga masters from India to chant in his church. He's like, I've never done this before. And then he goes to yoga. But there's a lot of this. And so there's a lot of people who get involved through their churches and use that as like an organizing platform. But there are also people who I talked to who spoke about how their faith sustained them, right? Like, there's a woman I write about who, Ella Rose, who, she talked about not wanting to be bullied out of her house. Like Dominion offered to buy her house. She's right next to the compressor station. But eventually, their cause attracts the attention of Al Gore and the Reverend William Barber II and his Poor People's Campaign, and they come and do a rally with 1,000 people in Union Hill. And, she told me later, she's like, when the Reverend offered to bless her house, she's like, I was levitating. She's like, and so her faith was very important to her finding the energy to fight this company. So that, to me, that's the role that religion played in this story. Yeah.
So Nelson County is not far from Charlottesville, where University of Virginia is. I just wonder if there wasn't some influence from people associated with the university to help this move along.
A lot of people were upset that UVA, University of Virginia, didn't do more. One reason perhaps it didn't is that Tom Farrell, the CEO of Dominion Energy, was the chair of the board. And today, the new CEO is on the board. And the chief counsel of Dominion Energy is also on the board of the university. So, I don't know, you could draw your own conclusions, but I think some people thought relatively affluent community, they're just glad it didn't come through there. But there were some researchers, independent, like adjunct faculty, who were involved and helped Union Hill. And Rick Webb spent 35 years at UVA.
Because northern Nelson County is sort of a bedroom community for Charlottesville.
It is.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is.
So Dominion, didn't they build some of the pipeline in West Virginia?
Yeah, there are about 30 to 40 miles of pipe in the ground in West Virginia. There's no pipe in Virginia. They felled trees along the route. West Virginia was friendlier political terrain. But they succeeded in keeping the pipe out of the ground in Virginia.
And that's not going to be pulled back out, it just sits there.
No, it will never be pulled out.
Oh, will it?
No, it's up to FERC. They decide.
Oh.
And they decide what happens to restore the route. And they could have required Dominion, but they decided it would be more disturbance at this point to dig it all up again.
So it's just there doing nothing.
Yeah, it'll be for future archaeologists to puzzle these like giant sections of pipe.
It goes nowhere.
Goes
from
nowhere. Goes nowhere. But, there's this instead.
So this pipeline would have carried a lot of energy. And that would have either displaced existing energy, I don't know what it would have displaced, but, so what's the overall energy situation where this pipeline was going?
I mean, Virginia's economy didn't slow down, right? The lights stayed on.
Yeah.
And people didn't freeze in their homes for lack of natural gas for their furnaces. People will say, well, you didn't build this, you stopped this, that just means that gas will find another way out of the Marcellus Shale. The argument for pipelines is that they are much more efficient ways to move molecules of methane than like compressing it, putting it on tanker trucks or rail cars. Those are riskier ways to move gas. No doubt a pipeline's a better way to move gas, but the people who fought this project would say, you're saying we need it, but you're also saying contradictory things. Dominion and FERC, who approves the project, you're saying without this, the gas won't find its way to market. But you're also saying there's no real impact because if it isn't built, it'll find a way out one way or the other. And I think you would, if you listen to the companies, and I do, their investor calls, if you read between the lines, they know that if you don't build this stuff, more gas will stay in the ground. It creates friction, right, to stop this pipeline infrastructure. And they'll say, oh, that just means we'll burn more coal or we'll burn dirtier forms of energy that come from somewhere else. There's not much evidence for that in our region, eastern US. But those are the sorts of arguments that are now being deployed to justify building a lot more gas export terminals, a lot of them in the Gulf Coast. They liquefy this stuff, put it on tankers, ship it to India, South Korea, Japan. And the argument there is like, if we don't build more pipelines and more gas export terminals, which again will be operating for many decades, then those countries are going to burn coal. And that's worse. Depends. It's not that simple. And so that's a whole nother book and a whole nother story. I'm not going to write that book, but yeah.
Didn't you say in the beginning the pipeline was going to be in, but that the people in West Virginia and Virginia would not have access to it because it's going all the way down into North
Carolina and then probably South Carolina too.
Right. So it's not even benefiting them And that was part of what upset them.
That's right.
Wasn't it?
They thought we were getting all of this economic disruption. Maybe our well water, our businesses, you know, the guy who built the hotel, like, spent 6 figures legal fees fighting because they would have drilled the tunnel through the Blue Ridge right next to his hotel that he built by hand. And they said, even if we wanted it, we can't tap into the gas along the way. The way of electric power lines, you know, your high voltage transmission lines, they step down and the wires go to everyone's house. It's not like that. And so a lot of people suspected that their plan all along was to eventually extend it so they could export it, right? And that this narrative that like, oh, this is going to create jobs in like Norfolk, Virginia, and eastern North Carolina was always kind of a bait and switch. Dominion would they always deny that, right? But it's definitely the case that the way they justified the pipeline, so 2 companies, Duke and Dominion, Duke is like the North Carolina version of Dominion, was say, we will take the gas. Our own subsidiary electric utilities will use 80% of the gas for the power plants we plan to build. So they are their own customers. Snake eating its own tail. But then during the fight, again, this shows, you know, if you're wondering why you should fight, you delay it, they're forced to reveal that they didn't actually, there was no demand for those plants. They canceled them, most of them. So the rationale for the project starts falling away, piece by piece, until eventually the emperor has no clothes, and like they're forced to walk away from this and write off billions of dollars that they could have spent otherwise. So it's like, you know, the economic case was something that these ordinary citizens also had to attack. Not just like, oh, salamanders, you know. Nobody wants to kill the last cow-knob salamander. But like, let's face it, that's not gonna stop something like this. Even the steep slopes, oh, a mountain's gonna fall on my town. Even that's not gonna stop. But if you can attack the economic rationale, the heart of something this massive, then you've got some leverage, and they succeeded in doing that too. And now, and again, I reference the backlash. So now, like everybody knows about this in Virginia, and everybody knows like Dominion's been overcharging them, and they know what the State Corporation Commission is. Talk about another boring, like, you know, fluorescent light lit room. People had no idea what that is. Now they do. And guess what? It's open to the public. You can go to those hearings and you can say, I don't think what Dominion's planning to build is in my interest. And that is now on their radar. And it wasn't before. This thing blew up spectacularly in their face.
And the next thing you need to do is get this across all the radars, because this really isn't that unique. This is their playbook. This is the way.
Absolutely right. That's absolutely right.
You could take the names of your book out and put in some names of local people here.
It's
went
true.
through exactly the same.
Yeah.
All the same.
In all corners of the country.
Amazingly similar. It's
Yep.
Like, my
Yeah.
God.
Louisiana, Oregon. Yeah, all over.
It's like everywhere.
And what's rare, and again, why I thought, all right, maybe I'll write a book about this, they won. And so really, I was really trying to do 2 things. One, figure out for myself, but for anyone who's interested, people in other communities, like how did they do it? And 2, how was this sold all along? Like why did they have to do this anyway? Why did they have to go to these lengths, Joyce and everyone else? What explains this building spree?
That 10% guaranteed rate of
The
return.
narrative and the incentives and the 10%, the 14% rate of return explains a lot. And so it's something I thought more people should know.
Thank you so much for sharing all that with us.
Mm-hmm.
I feel
Coming back, I encourage you to listen to natural gas regulation.